said pick something from the 90s, and I thought that might be easy. I've been around since then. And then I realized everything I have from the 90s is on a cassette tape. Brian said, we don't do cassettes anymore. So I found one. He had family, friends, and money, and loved the Lord with all his heart. And the devil went to God and said, oh, Job would fall apart if you should take away his fortune. Let me put him to the test. And soon poor Job had lost his health and wealth and all the rest. And as his troubles added up, he fell down on his knees and said, Lord, I still got one thing, and that's your love for me. You got to count your blessings, find one if you try. Count on the Lord and watch that blessing multiply. Your might have, should have been on nothing but distressing. When you're down and out, it's time to count your blessings. You might go through hard times when you fall into despair. Remember you're surrounded by his blessings everywhere. They're in a neighbor's helping hand or in the sunshine of their smile. One blessing leads to one more you'll be counting for a while. Best to look at what you have, forget what you have not. Just learn a lesson from old Job. Be thankful what you got. You've got to count your blessings. Find one if you try. Count on the Lord and watch that blessing multiply. Your might have, should have been on nothing but distressing. When you're down and out, it's time to count your blessings. One risen Savior, one perfect love, one holy promise, one is enough. You better count your blessings, find one if you try. Count on the Lord and watch that blessing multiply. Your might have, should have been on nothing but distressing. When you're down and out, it's time to count your blessings. Count your blessings. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings.
Well, good morning. I tell you, I'm glad that you are here this morning. And if you would, please open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. All right. I love that excitement. A little early this morning, we were dragging a little bit. So I'm glad that you're fired up. We are really in the middle of a series that I've called Big Questions. It's really around some of life's really most important questions that we need to deal with and really think through about life. So it's not small questions, it's big questions. And if you remember last week, we dealt with a really big question. I mean, is it reasonable to believe that God exists? You know, a lot of us would say we believe it, but is it reasonable to believe it? Remember, we looked at Genesis 1. You know, did God create the universe? Did he design it? And one of the really big questions that I think a lot of Christians have today is this: well, does modern science and faith not go together? In other words, if I'm going to embrace science, do I need to reject my faith? I mean, do they tie together? And what we've really discovered is that actually some of the greatest names in science will tell you they have become card-carrying Christians, not in spite of science, but actually because of science. I mean, even today, people like Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, which produced the first reference sequence of the human DNA instruction book. He is now director of the National Institute of Health. He is really like the scientist. So if you're in the scientific world, he's the man, you know. And that's just kind of the way it is. And he looked at everything that science had discovered about the beginnings of the universe and looked at everything about the beginning of life. And he called it, and I quote, God's eloquent plan for creating humankind. And then he will quickly go and tell you about his faith in Christ. And so we discovered that actually faith and science are not in conflict with each other, that actually God is the author of both, that all truth is God's truth, both science and theology. But the truth is also someone did an unscientific survey, and they asked really an interesting question, and it was this. If you could ask Siri any question, what would it be? Now, I mean, if you were going to pick up your phone, ask Siri an in-depth question, a big question, what would it be? And I thought it was really interesting because, you know, you would think when it comes to questions like this, they might say, well, Siri, is there a God? And that really wasn't the question. What they found was the most often asked question was really a much deeper question. And it was this: well, Siri, if God exists, what difference does it make? In other words, if God does exist, so what? I mean, if he exists, what really impact does it have on my life? Does it really matter? In fact, there was a priest that had an atheist friend that asked them this very question. I mean, if God exists, does it matter? And the priest had to admit, he said, I got to be honest with you, I had a hard time answering that question. I mean, if God exists, what difference does it make? And he writes a blog, and he asked people, he said, listen, if you were asked that question, how would you answer? And he got one interesting response. One responded by saying that what he was going to do is he was going to live for a year as if God did not exist. Now, he never really told what that year was like or how that year may have been different from other years in his life, but that was the question he posed. He was going to live as if God did not exist. And when I read that, I thought, you know, to me it's interesting that he states the question that way because in many ways we have an entire book of the Bible that really deals with that question. I mean, if God exists, what difference does it make? In fact, it is the book of Ecclesiastes. You know, the book of Ecclesiastes was written by a man named Solomon, who is the king of Israel. He is pictured really as the Bible's wisest man, who ever lived. In fact, this is the last of 3 books that Solomon wrote. Now, the first book he wrote was called the Song of Solomon, and it was a book on romance written as a young man. So let me tell you, if you want to blush, read that book. I mean, I want to tell you, it's one of those you're reading it like, oh, yeah, you know. It's one of those things, it's a book of romance, you know. And he writes that, and then really he writes the book of Proverbs, which one would argue really kind of as a middle age, realizations about life. And then he writes the book of Ecclesiastes, which some would say, well, it's a book of regrets written as an old man when he looked back at a time of his life when he had tried to live without God. Now, one pastor said you could describe Ecclesiastes kind of like this. It was a time of his life, really, when Solomon just kind of went off the rails, and he put God in a box, and he sealed God in this box, and he went down into his basement, and he covered the box with bricks, and he lived as if God did not exist. Now, the question I would think about, well, how did that work out? I mean, Solomon, if that's what you're going to do, what were the results of this? And if you ever read the book of Ecclesiastes and you want to get really depressed, read that book. If you're looking for encouragement, I wouldn't recommend necessarily the book of Ecclesiastes, because here was his conclusion to this. Verse 1, he starts really at the beginning. Verse 1 of chapter 1, he said, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. What does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Now, I would say to you, don't miss it, because the key at the beginning of the book, he really puts also at the end or back door of the book. I put it on your outline, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 8. Notice what he says. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Everything is futile. Now, it's possible your translation might say meaningless or vanity, but the truth is, you cannot miss the point. And I don't want you to miss the Hebrew mindset that is behind it. This book was written in Hebrew. So, for instance, when we want to emphasize something in English, what do? We put an exclamation point behind it. Now, if you want to know how that's used, look at some of the teenagers when they send text messages or social message each other. There might be 50 exclamation points. It's this emphatic statement. Well, in Hebrew, they didn't have that, but what they would do is they would repeat the word. So in other words, they would say it again and again for emphasis. Now, in one verse, the word futile or meaninglessness occurs 5 times. So it is the equivalent of putting 5 exclamation points at the end of the verse. But it really doesn't stop there. In fact, he uses this word futility 38 different times in the book. In effect, Solomon is saying this: life without God is a big zero. It really is nothing times nothing equals nothing. Now, the reason I think we ought to really pay attention to what Solomon says is because, listen, when you understand, he had a lifetime of exhaustive research. He had personal experience. If anyone on the planet had the resources to pursue any pleasure that he possibly could have ever thought of, it was Solomon. If someone had all the possessions that any human being could ever desire, it would be Solomon. If anyone really wanted power, that he could do basically whatever he wanted to do, it was Solomon. And yet, he writes this book to reveal the single most important lesson that anyone can learn about life. And he's simply saying this: if all there is to life is this life, then it's meaningless. In other words, everything is nothing if everything is all that there is. Now, I would say when you read this book, it begs the question of God, this big question, and the difference that God makes. Now, Solomon, what he does, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, really what he does in this book, he says the same thing in many different ways for 12 chapters. So if you want to really go through some depressing statements and thoughts sometimes about life, read this book. He's saying, man, you can go this direction, you can have this pleasure, you can have that possession, you can have this power, and the bottom line is without God, it really just doesn't matter. And so basically what he's saying is, if you could summarize the book or even the message today in a sentence, he was saying that only God can make the matter of life matter. Now, we're going to look at some things that only God can give us that make the matter of life really matter. Number one, what we're going to find is that without God, number one, there is no transcendent meaning. There is no transcendent meaning. Now, listen, I wanted to throw in that word transcendent just so you knew that I'd read a book, that's one of those words that just kind of make you sound smart, transcendent. What does that mean? Well, it's a big word, but it's really not that hard of a word. Transcendent just means, something beyond this life. In other words, can you find meaning beyond just what's here? Now, Solomon basically says if all there is to this life is life, then life would mean nothing. Now, it's interesting, John Hopkins did a survey and asked 8,000 college students from 48 different colleges, asked them an interesting question. What he asked them was, what do you consider the most important thing about your life? And I thought it was interesting. The number one answer by a whopping 75%, these students said their goal was to find a purpose and a meaning to my life. That was their quest. I mean, they didn't feel they had it. They didn't really know where to get it. So their goal is to find purpose and meaning in life. Now, Solomon explicitly says without God, that is going to be a fruitless search. If there is no God, then life ultimately is meaningless. If our lives are doomed to end in death, then not only does life not matter, but it doesn't matter how we live our life, because in the end, it really doesn't make a difference whether we've existed or not. Now, James in chapter 4 talks about the brevity of life, the uncertainty of life, and notice how he puts it. He said in verse 14, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be, for you are like vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Now, Dr. James Merritt put it this way, and I quote, he said, "It is not just true that life is brief and passes quickly and is relatively short. It is pointless apart from God. It has no meaning. Add up all the money you make, all the titles you have, all the stocks and bonds you own, all the times you get your name in the newspaper, all the promotions you get, and all the ladders you climb. Without God, it is one big zero." He says, as you too famously saying, those who are searching often still haven't found what they're looking for. Well, that's not really encouraging, is it? I mean, but if you think about it, listen, you remove God from the equation, then really, what is the transcendent meaning of life? Where do we find objective value to our life? Now, listen, it seems pretty evident to me that our culture has really kind of taken a more dramatic rise in secularism. I mean, it's just become kind of the more pervasive worldview in our culture. Now, what has happened often with that has been a rejection of some have called the biblical worldview or the Christian worldview. And one of the things that goes with the Christian worldview, if you're going to reject it, is this belief that we find in Scripture that every single human being, regardless of ethnicity or gender or class or opinion, they have intrinsic value from conception until natural death. That everyone, every race, every gender, they matter. They have objective value because they have the very image of God in them. Now, you might say, well, Scott, I mean, my goodness, you know, that even secularists believe that people matter. I hear them speak all the time, and I would say, well, that's true. But what I would say is when you reject a biblical worldview and you're going to embrace secularism and you're going to say that every single person matters, it now becomes your opinion. It's no longer objectively true that everyone matters. It's what you think everyone matters, and everyone should respond to that. And so therefore, there's really no inherent value. You end up really having to create your own value. And so it kind of becomes a devaluing of life. Now, you say, well, does this have any impact on culture? Well, you're going to expect a preacher like me to say what I'm about to say. I can't prove the correlation, but I think it's no accident that one of the things we see, you know, we've seen this rise in incredible violence, and there may be lots of reasons for that, but certainly there is a devaluing of human life. One of the things that we know is that since the year 2000, that drug overdoses have increased 400%. We also know that in the most recent years, about the last same time period, suicide rates in virtually every state has almost risen double digits, except in Nevada, which was already dramatically high. And actually, in the last 3 years, for the first time in I don't know how long, the average lifespan has slightly declined. And you say, well, you know, what is that? Well, what happens is, listen, if you're going to reject the idea that we have objective value and it's just kind of a subjective thing, then what happens is you have to create your own identity. I mean, somehow you've got to figure out what your value is. And to me, that's really what we hear from our culture. It is this quest. I mean, you know, what is it? Well, Hollywood says, you know, listen, here's the deal. You know, you've got to find your truth. That's where you'll find your value. It's in your truth. Disney will tell us,
I got to be me. That's it. It's about me being me. It's something in me where I can really find this intrinsic value. And so, listen, to me, we have a culture that is really looking for where we can find value. And it becomes discouraging and it becomes devastating and hopeless, because I think if we're all honest, we know that we can't solve our own problems. I mean, we don't have all the answers. Now, listen, you may be a lot smarter than me, but if I've got to have the answer to all my problems, I'm in big trouble. I mean, it didn't take me very long to realize there's a lot of things I can't solve, a lot of issues I struggle with that obviously I cannot resolve. And so, listen, a culture that's saying to this generation, listen, your identity is found in your feelings, or your identity is found in your ethnicity or your gender or your sexual preference. I would say you are much more than that. You are a man or woman created in the very image of God. You have objective value. You don't have to get approval from everyone else. I don't have to affirm that. That's given to you because you're created in his image. You are created with a purpose. God has a plan for you. And we will always be searching and we will be desperate, trying to find affirmation until we affirm that our value is found in him. Listen, if you are the ultimate answer to all your problems, you are just going to spin your wheels, you are going to run in circles, and you are going to climb ladders, but you will be going nowhere. Someone said life without God is like a rat race run on a treadmill. And someone said if life is a rat race, even if you win at the end, you're still just a rat. So, the folks says we have this purpose. Now it's interesting how Solomon closes this chapter. Listen, this gets really depressing. But notice what he says. He says, there is no remembrance of those who came before and of those who will come after. There will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. So where do you find meaning? When I read that verse, I was reminded a couple of months ago, I did a graveside service at a cemetery out in western Oklahoma. It was a very rural area. And I remember that day leaving the cemetery, and as I walked by, there was a grave marker. And what got my attention was a grave marker of a man who had lived roughly from the 1820s to the 1875, 1880. And it had his name, and it said, "Gone but never forgotten." And I had this thought that crossed my mind. I thought, well, the truth is he's gone, but in all likelihood, he is forgotten. Unless he had connected with his Creator. Unless he had given away his faith maybe to his children. And then his children to the next generation. And then to the next generation. Because, folks, the truth is your life has meaning. Even transcendent meaning. But it's only found in relationship with the God who has created you. The God who has made you. The God who gives you objective value that doesn't have to be affirmed by anyone because he has given it to you. Well, number two, what is this? Not only transcendent meaning, but secondly, without God, there is no objective morality. Objective morality. In other words, it stands to reason if there is no meaning to life, really there can be no morality in life. There really isn't a right that is always right or a wrong that is always wrong. There really isn't a good that is always good and a bad that is always bad. Now, one of my favorite speakers and authors is Ravi Zacharias. And several years ago, he was speaking at the University of Nottingham, England, and he tells about a rather exasperated student in the audience that was really attacking the idea of God and this whole idea that how could the God of the Bible exist with all the evil and suffering that is in the world. And his point is, in fact, you'll hear it often, that the God of the Bible cannot possibly exist because of the evil and suffering that happens in our world. And so this student asked Ravi this question. He simply said, how can there possibly be a God with all the evil and suffering that exist in the world? And so Ravi asked him, he said, well, can we talk about this issue for a moment? And the student said, sure, we can. Well, this was the conversation, and I hope you'll listen. Ravi asked, when you say there is such a thing as evil, are you not assuming there is such a thing as good? The student said, well, of course. Ravi said, well, when you're assuming that there is such a thing as good, are you not also assuming there is such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which you distinguish between what is good and what is evil. He said, well, yeah, I suppose so. Ravi said, well, if there is a moral law, then you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that is who you're trying to disprove and not prove. If there is no moral lawgiver, there is no moral law. If there is no moral law, there is no good. If there is no good, there is no evil. So I'm not sure what your question is. The student classically responded, neither am I. Can you please tell me what I should be asking you? Now, folks, I hope you'll get that. I mean, some people say, well, the presence of evil begs the question of God, when in reality, if you're going to make that judgment that something is evil, then you're positing the idea that there is some moral lawgiver that defines that as evil, correct? I mean, so that really becomes the argument. Now, I want you to hear what I'm saying. Listen, you don't need God to believe there's a right and wrong and a good and an evil, and you don't need God to try and live according to what you think is right or wrong or good and evil. So I want to be clear. I am not saying that an atheist cannot be moral. In fact, I would argue there's a lot of atheists that live much more morally, even biblically speaking, than some people who claim to be Christians. But I am saying that if you claim to be an atheist, there is no grounding for your morality except your opinion. Ultimately, you think that's right. You think it should be imposed. And you may have a great argument to defend that, but it simply becomes your opinion. And so that's kind of where we live often in our world. Right and wrong becomes a matter of either emotion. You know, you do what you feel is right or wrong. Or it becomes a matter of intellect. You do what you think is right or wrong. Or it becomes a matter of opinion. You do what others tell you is right or wrong. But there is no ultimate, final, objective right and wrong apart from God. That's why Dostoevsky years ago said, without God, everything is permitted. So without God, doing something immoral would be an illusion or nonsense. All moral standards would be arbitrary. In fact, William Lane Craig said, thus, if atheism is true, it becomes impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil, nor can one praise brotherhood, equality, or love as good. Now, the point is simply this. When you say, or I say, hey, listen, no, that is wrong, when you do, you are appealing to a standard that you think everyone should have. Now, it's, you know, a lot of research, they talk about morality from culture to culture to culture, whether you're talking about the ancient Egyptians or Greeks or Hindu background, whatever. It's interesting, there was some common morality. For instance, in virtually every culture, loyalty is praised. In virtually every culture, honesty is a good thing. And generosity is a good thing. Now, what happens is many great thinkers said, well, listen, this type of moral conscience could not have happened from naturalism or from evolution, natural selection. I mean, if it's the survival of the fittest, that stuff just wouldn't work. So it has to be a creator. Now, I would argue that's exactly what it posits. In fact, Genesis 1:27, have it on your outline. The Bible says, so God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. So you have been created in God's image. There is this moral conscience. Now, often we violate that, but the truth is there is this moral conscience that we have. So I just wanted to give you something called the moral argument. In fact, it was actually this, we'll talk in a minute, that C.S. Lewis became convinced in theism and then ultimately Christianity because of this. Basically, it's this, that every moral law has a moral lawgiver. So if you're going to call a moral law good or bad, then there's someone who is given this moral law. Number two, obviously there is a universal moral law. You know, I don't know anyone who would say it's okay to torture babies for fun. You know, I mean, I don't know really any culture that says it. So there is some type of universal moral law. Therefore, number three, there is a universal moral lawgiver. This God who is the creator. Now, I don't know the story of C.S. Lewis. He's one of the great minds, certainly of the 20th century Christian minds. He spent much of his life as an atheist. And he began to struggle with this idea that as an atheist, how come I have this belief that certain things are morally right and morally wrong? And he concluded that, well, this had to come from God. That we're created in the image of God, and right and wrong has been placed in our hearts. It's a part of who we are. In fact, I love this paraphrase of Romans 2. Paul put it this way. He said, when outsiders, in other words, those who've never heard of God's law, those who don't know the truth of God, follow it more or less by instinct, they confirm its truth by their obedience. They show that God's law is not something alien imposed on us from without, but woven into the very fabric of our creation. There is something deep within them that echoes God's yes and no, right and wrong. In other words, there is a moral compass given from a moral law giver, God the Creator. And what Solomon is saying is this. He's saying when we live in right relationship with our Creator, based on His design, it brings not only purpose to our life, but it brings transcendent meaning to our life. That our life can matter beyond this one. See, the point is that without God, we must ultimately live without hope. In other words, old age, disease, and death have the final say to life. I mean, let's be honest. Everyone that's in this room, we fight a losing battle with aging. I mean, do you ever go and look at some old pictures? I'm at this age where now social media, I'll get friends on Facebook, and I'll recognize the name, and I do not recognize the picture, and I realize we went to high school together. And then I'm thinking, I bet I look that old too. Man, hopefully I look better than that, And you realize, you know what? Can't change that, can you? I mean, it's just going to happen. And this body is going to deteriorate. And at some point, disease takes its toll. I mean, it's just the way it is. And so if all there is to this life is this life, then what you're going to end with is asking, listen, what's the difference? What difference does my life make? Now, listen. But if there is a God, particularly the God of the Bible, who came to this earth in the person of Jesus Christ, in spite of our sin, this God who was born of a virgin, this God who lived a sinless life and died on a Roman cross for your sins and my sins, that we might be forgiven, that he might deliver us from our sin. This God who is risen from the dead, that he might deliver us from death. In other words, if the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ is true, then listen, hope springs eternal. It is Jesus who makes all the difference. It is in him we can find why we're created, what our purpose is, how we can live a life that matters now and for eternity. That's why the wisest man who ever lived tried his best to live a life without God. He came to this conclusion. Notice on your outline. This is how he ends the book. He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard, and this is what he says. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, here's the conclusion. Listen, only God can make this life really matter. Why? Because you have objective value. God has created you. He has a purpose for you. He has a design for you. You matter to him. God alone can provide the answer to the ache of our souls. So let me tell you, this means that you matter to God. It means that he loves you at your best and at your worst. It means that he has made you, but uniquely gifted you to live a life with great purpose that's found in a relationship with Christ. In spite of our sin, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And when we enter into a relationship with him, we discover the very purpose for our lives, why we're here. Now, the question you might ask is, well, how do I live a life that embraces this God who exists? Well, when I thought about that, I was reminded when Kelly and I were in seminary, we pastored a great rural church in southern Mississippi. And we loved being there. It was a great church, but this was a rural church. So what that means was basically we were obviously the only ministerial staff they had, And really at that church, they didn't have anything like a student ministry. I mean, really, the students didn't really have anything that they did. And so at that time, Kelly and I, we were a whole lot younger, and we decided, you know what? We're going to do a lot of student ministry stuff along with our pastor for these kids. So one of the first things that we were going to do is they had this student conference at First Baptist Church of Jackson. And man, we got all the kids together, our high schoolers, and had a great time with them. We went to this cool pizza place, did something for the students. And I thought, man, this is going to be an awesome student conference. So we get there, it's really good. And then the main speaker, I'm sitting down second row, and I see who the main speaker is. And he's walking to the podium, and it is this old dude that can barely walk to the podium. And I'm thinking, oh, are you kidding me? I mean, I brought these kids here. This is going to be terrible. I mean, what are they thinking? I mean, the whole time, I'm like, so he slowly makes his way, and you know who he was? He was Truett Cathy. This was in 1990. He was older at the time. He came up, and you know who Truett Cathy is? The founder of Chick-fil-A. Now, who does not like Chick-fil-A? Something's wrong with you if you don't like Chick-fil-A, is all I got to say. But, it's so weird. I honestly will never forget what he said that day. I remember it right now. I can tell you his outline. He stood in front of all the students, and he said, listen, he says, if you want to live a life that matters, if you want to live a life that's going to be transcendent, that's going to have meaning, he said, you got to answer 3 questions. He said, the first decision you got to make is who will be your master. He said, everyone has a master. You live for something. And he said, you got to decide that. Are you going to live for yourself? Is that going to be your focus? You're going to live for other people, what they think? Are you going to live for culture? Is that going to drive what you do? Or are you going to live for Jesus? He said, I decided a long time ago, I'm going to give my life to the master. And he said, I've been following Jesus for years. He said, the second question you need to ask is who will be your mate? Now, let me give a caveat here. The truth is, some of you, God's calling for life may be to singleness, and that is a valid calling. You can make a kingdom impact from that, and God may call you to that. But the truth is, many may be called to marriage, and that's how you're going to fulfill your kingdom purpose. And he said, so you need to make the big decision, who will be your mate? Are they also committed to the master? Are you committed to living in a way that's going to matter for the kingdom? He said, you got to think that through. And then he said, there's a third thing you've got to decide. What's going to be your mission? What's your life going to be about? What's your family going to be about? What's the direction of your life? Is it going to be about money? Is it going to be about your career? Or is it going to be about the kingdom? He said, if you want to live a life that matters, make Jesus your master and live for his kingdom. And he said, you will discover significance, purpose, and the joy of eternal life. Now, I thought to myself, that is exactly what Solomon is saying. You want to find real meaning? Fear God, follow his commands, live a life that lives out the purpose for which you have been created. If you get distracted from that, then you've missed the point. Now you say, well, how do I get in line with that? Well, you got to begin by being in a right relationship with God through Christ. Our sin has separated us from God. Christ has bridged the gap through his death, burial, and resurrection. And today, you can trust him. Say, well, I'm a follower of Christ. Well, listen, then today, you may need to recommit your life. Today, God may be speaking about being a part of the Olivet family. In fact, we're having a new session of discovering Olivet next week. Maybe God wants you to know more what this body of believers is about. How can we make an eternal impact together? Maybe there's other prayer needs you have.